Okay, well, thank you to everyone who is watching this live, or if you're watching it on catch up. It's really great to have you here. So, this is Mercy UK kicking off our Mental Health Awareness Week. And the general theme this week, there's a theme every year. The theme this year is community. And as a, oh, let me just pop my phone on silent. There we go. And for we are a Christian mental health charity. So for most of us as Christians, when we talk about mental health and community, um, community equals church. And so this year we wanted to really go in and tackle those big questions around faith, mental health, and the church. And today we're asking that really big question: is mental health still a taboo subject in church? Tomorrow, if you're able to join us for that lunchtime conversation, we are going to be looking at it from the perspective of church and go, if you are a church wanting to remove the taboo, what are some of the challenges? What does it look like? What are the top tips? So tomorrow we're going to be looking at it more from the perspective of people that are in church and trying to remove the taboo as much as possible. And then on Thursday lunchtime, we get to take a step back from today's conversation, from Wednesday's conversation, and just really look at the common themes, understand what some of the conclusions are, and then to think really practically, what can we start to do differently? So let's get started. Let's ask the big question: is mental health still a taboo subject within the church? And I am so grateful today to have this amazing panel of people that all come with different hats, different perspectives, all people that are really passionate about this subject. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to them just to introduce themselves quickly, to let us know who they are and what their perspective is on this question: is mental health still a taboo subject within the church? So Derek, can I ask you to go first?
Great, thank you. Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Derek Smith. I lead a group of churches in the northwest of England called Kings. I'm based in the sunny, beautiful, little picturesque fishing village called Bolton. And if you're not laughing, it's because you've never been to Bolton. I run for the Assemblies of God something called the Healthy Church Network. We're 648 churches in the UK. And I oversee the whole project of making sure that health is a high priority, and we do a lot of schemes to do that. I also serve on the World Health Church Board for Assemblies of God worldwide, 440,000 churches, and I'm also on the board of the Evangelical Alliance. So that's what I do on a Monday afternoon. The rest of the time, I'm trying my best to be a pastor to people. So the question that we're kind of looking at today is it a taboo subject? Well, it's as taboo as the individual church allows it to be. I think generally on my travels across more churches, I think it's increasingly less of a taboo subject, because I think more pastors are aware that if you're going to lead people, mental health is such a major part of leading people and pastoring and caring for people. So I think increasingly it's less of a taboo, but as a churches, we can still do better.
Great, thank you, Derek. Really appreciate that. Hayley, can I come to you?
Yep. So I'm Hayley. I grew up in London, now living in sunny West Yorkshire. It's sunny this week, so I can say that this week. Yeah, my hat that I'm wearing for this meeting is kind of lived experience. So I actually did the Mercy program back in 2013-14. So about 12 years ago now, long time. And yeah, since kind of the age of 11 through to I'm 30 now, I've had various mental health issues the whole kind of time. And I've been in church from the age of 2. So I've had great experiences, bad experiences of how that's been handled, treated, all of that. On the side, I also have some counselling training, so there'll be a little bit of that in there as well. And I also work for a well-known Christian debt charity, which obviously we work with a lot of churches who are on the front lines doing this stuff. So kind of a little bit of that in the background as well. And whether it's taboo, I think I agree with you, Derek. On the whole, I think it's getting less, but I do think there's kind of a way to go. A real mixed bag, I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hayley. Hannah.
Hello, hi, I'm Hannah. I also am in sunny West Yorkshire. It's beautiful, isn't it, this week? um, I am a psychotherapist and I work for a community mental health team. I specialise in working with individuals with complex long-term trauma and complex PTSD. So that's my working job, as it were, paid employment. And I'm also on the leadership team of our church here and have been for I was like, oh gosh, longer than I was like realizing, over 16 years. Yeah, so I guess there'll probably be a little bit of both coming through today when I'm thinking about this. Very passionate about therapy and mental health in that sense, but also, yeah, I guess have some interesting experiences from being in church leadership. I thought it was an interesting question. I was saddened by the statistics, Bryn. I think you told us that 76% of people said they thought that it was still a taboo subject. That made me really sad. I hope that within our community it's not, and feel like, as you guys have said, it's probably becoming less so. I think there's probably maybe a lot of fear around it still. I also, on the flip side, have some interesting thoughts. I think about sometimes churches becoming almost overly therapeutic and trying to be something other than what we are as a church. And I think that might be interesting for us to think about as well. Yeah, so those are kind of my initial thoughts, I guess.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. And last but not least, Will.
Hey, so I'm Will van der Hart. I am one of the founding directors of the Mind and Soul Foundation. So we started working around mental health stigma in the church in 2005. So it's been a great journey and love partnership with Mercy over the years as well. I'm now the Wellbeing Chaplain of the Revitalise Trust Network. So we're 184 churches across the UK. And I just look after church leaders primarily with relationship to mental health and burnout. And I work in a multidisciplinary team with lots of clinicians to help get good outcomes for Christians with mental health issues. So I take quite a mixed model, which is primarily a sort of therapeutic pharmacological model, but then look at how Christian theology is the kind of container within which we might encounter all sorts of healing and recovery. I think I've seen a massive change over the last 20 years between kind of taboo to kind of conversational mental health engagement. But what I've also noticed is that stigma has changed its face. So it used to be that stigma was very, very defined stigma, like, oh, okay, this is, everything is a sort of demonization, or everything is, a lack of faith or a lack of determination to kind of accept the gifts of the Spirit, or, the true new nature in Christ. It was very defined stigma. Now I hear a lot of leaders using psychological terminology, but ultimately still hiding stigma in the same sort of package. So, a really good healing is a faith healing. You need medication, but only for a short time as a prop before you receive a real healing. Or, therapy is okay, but it's no replacement for biblical counselling. So there is a sort of psychological openness, but there's still stigma around recovery. It's just more hidden. And so people feel, and often, people often feel that they're safe in a church environment when they maybe have long-term mental health struggles and need lifelong medication or therapeutic intervention. But then after some time, they realize actually that there's a similar stigma. It was just cloaked behind psychological terminology. So I think there's still quite a long way to go. I've been really delighted to see some of the progress that we've made. But if you're looking for parity between physical health and mental health and the way the church treats those two things, I think there's still a massive gap.
Amazing. Thank you, Will. Well, I really appreciate your initial thoughts on all of that. And great to get a general sense, I think, that we're feeling, which is that it is getting better. So that's good. There's still some way to go. I think we can all agree on that. There will always be a disparity between what church we're talking about. And we knew that when we put the question together. When you say, is mental health still a taboo within the church? The answer is, well, it depends what church you're talking about. But we do want to dig down into that, because the fact is, So Hannah, you mentioned the statistics. This was just a poll amongst our supporters. So this is not robust research. It was just a pulse, getting our finger on the pulse ahead of this week. But yeah, we did find that for people that follow Mercy, that are passionate about mental health within the church, 79% said yes, they still feel like it is a taboo subject. What was interesting is that we also emailed all of the church leaders that use Keys to Freedom, which is our workbook, within their church, and asked them, what are some of the biggest challenges you're facing? And even amongst the leaders, about half the challenges that came back could be summarized as it's still a taboo. We still find it difficult to talk about within our leadership. And I think the point you made, Will, is really interesting, that to some extent the issue is that the issue has changed. It's not necessarily that people don't want to have the conversation. I think now people just feel overwhelmed and don't know how to have the conversation. So in some ways it's just shifted. But nevertheless, the lived experience is that people walk into church struggling with their mental health and still, for whatever reason, don't feel completely safe and comfortable being honest and open about that, or have had experience where they've been burnt. So I think I want to start today, if it's okay, to just own the fact that it is still a problem in some places, and actually just to kind of spend a bit of time thinking about that, because my guess is the majority of people that watch this now, that watch it on catch up, that engage with it, are engaging with it because they have either personally been on the receiving end of some bad advice or of feeling like they're being stigmatized. So I feel like it's really important to just start there and just accept the fact we're not talking about statistics. We are talking about real people that walk through the church door and feel like there is something wrong with them because they are struggling with their mental health. So Hayley, do you mind if I pick on you? Because you kind of started today saying that actually one of the main hats you're wearing is that you do have lived experience. You've been through lots of church environments. Would you mind sharing any experiences that you've had of where you have felt stigmatized, or where you have felt in any way less than for the fact that you have struggled with your mental health?
Yeah, I think a couple of things really, but one of the things that sticks out to me is I was part of a church for several years and really involved and kind of doing a lot of hours, part of the Bible college, so there sort of day and night. And then I reached, well, burnout really is what happened, but because I have mental health in my life, it sort of triggered all that to come back quite a bit worse. And all I actually did was, swap myself off a worship rota for a week because I'm not really up to it, And the result of doing that a couple of times, despite being kind of all in, the kind of almost model Christian Bible college student, was that I got pulled aside, taken off all the teams, all the several worship teams, young people's team, old people's team, Sunday team, everything, because I was unreliable and wasn't doing enough to help myself. And at that point, as sort of we had a couple of discussions, in between the discussions, I'd got help from, well, obviously God, Jesus, Holy Spirit, but from pastors as well, from friends and family, from a GP, and also was getting private therapy. So it was kind of a case of, I've not done anything that's a risk to anyone or myself. All I've done is swap a couple of rotas out, and I think it was that I found it really hard to be like, well, does the non-mentally ill person show up 100% of the time because they'll have a sick child, or maybe they're poorly, or they're on holiday? And actually, I think the hardest thing about it was, the standard is unrealistic, whoever you are. And it just made me feel like it was my fault, but they couldn't give me a kind of line to cross to be allowed back. I was like, well, what do you want me to do then on paper to get better? Like, if I'm doing all these things, what more can I do? And it put me in a bit of an impossible position. And I've seen a lot of friends go through similar to that as well, where I think we're really good as the church on the whole at coming alongside someone if they're struggling short term, but when it kind of carries on, it's like a nuisance now, at very least. And I think at that point, when people start getting removed from things that God's actually given them, gifts that, they're irrevocable gifts no matter what season you're in, and when you take those away, that doesn't actually help. So I think that was one of my kind of worst experiences, is kind of, it's almost taken away the privileges of being part of the community. And And obviously it depends how severe, what's happening in your life, and safeguarding obviously is another thing. But for the average kind of maybe working medium level depression, anxiety kind of stuff, that's quite hard hitting for a place that has become a family and should feel like a family. So that's some of my experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Hayley. I want to come back and ask why, as in from your perspective, why you think you were taken off and kind of what was behind all of that. But I think before we do that, can I just ask, is there anyone else that has a personal experience, sort of lived experience of feeling stigmatized or less than because of struggle? Will, I've just seen you on mute yourself, so I'm guessing you're getting ready to say something.
I mean, yeah, I mean, for me, like I just say, on entry, like the reason when I got ordained Anglican leadership, became a leader, and then I had a breakdown following the London bombings in 2005. My experience was, really felt really shocking, and I totally relate to Hayley's experience of this sort of shock and surprise at the reaction. And for me, it was sort of couched in, so it's often confusing for you because it's kind of couched in love, but actually it's not love. So it's sort of done with a pastoral covering, which is like, oh, we really think you need to do X, Y, and Z. And actually you're like, hold on a minute, this isn't right. And I think the stigma I experienced at the time, which is now quite a long time ago, sort of now, obviously, 20 years ago, was spiritualization and physicalization. So basically denying that there's any psychological reality to your experience. It's like you're tired, or the devil's got into you and the devil's kind of controlling you. Now, when you're a church leader, being tired is quite common, but the suggestion that you might be demonized is quite a problem for anyone else who might be under your leadership. So the stigma has very live and very real impacts. The fact that I needed time off was fine, but it's the implications of what's suggested around how you're doing and why you're doing it. I think Hayley's experience is really common. This idea that you're not aligned with your recovery. So I hear that a lot, especially from leaders from more Pentecostal backgrounds. Again, we talk about this isn't a uniform idea, but the sort of neo-Pentecostalism, particularly the idea that you need to be in alignment with the will of God and actually bring yourself into alignment with your healing. It's very interesting because, again, it's a specific sort of stigma associated with mental health. If someone's paraplegic and they come to church in a wheelchair, you wouldn't dare to say to them, oh, you need to bring yourself in alignment with your new body in Christ. Get out of your wheelchair. Now, I'm not saying Jesus doesn't heal paralyzed people, because he does. But the idea here is that you heal yourself. So Jesus Holy Spirit can heal someone who's paralyzed for sure, and Jesus does that in his ministry. But the paralyzed person is not responsible for their healing. But if you have a mental health problem, you are responsible in some denominations, and so it's quite subtle. What it does do is pathological guilt's a common part of most neurotic illness, so you already feel guilty. So then from an authority figure, the presumption that you're guilty for failing to be aligned to the healing that you should then receive, that doubles down on your problem. And then, undoubtedly, if you're depressed at that point, you'll definitely feel depressed after that point. So the sort of the implication of stigma, the lived experience of stigma is complex. It's couched in pastoral care. It's often delivered from authority figures. It has sort of spiritual or biblical mandates to it, which all work together to make you feel disempowered and unworthy. And that's why it's particularly pernicious in a church setting.
I mean, there's a lot in there, isn't there? I feel like we could probably just kind of springboard off that. I think there's loads of really, really great points in that, Will. Before we start to dive into some of those, Derek or Hannah, do either of you, whether it's personal experience or, I know we're kind of erring on the negative, we will get to the positive, but I feel like it's really important to just own some of these realities. Either do you have any experience, or have you seen it being done badly, and what's that look like in your view? Hannah?
I was just really struck, Hayley, what you said about maybe long-term community and long-term support. And I was thinking, oh yeah, that's really true, isn't it? That I do feel like in the church and out of it, but in the church because we're talking about it, we're good, aren't we, at walking with people for a short amount of time. But when somebody's difficulties continue, I just was like, yeah, that's really real. And I think it's a real challenge to us when we talk about being family together, when we talk about being a community. What does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? In being kind of the highs and the lows of people and sitting in the trenches for a really long time if we need to. So I was really struck with that of like, yes, I totally agree with you. And kind of, I guess, with a more church leader pastoral hat on, when we are trying to build community for people or wanting to make sure people are continuing to be supported, that can be really difficult sometimes. I think that people are like, oh yeah, I'm okay for a while, but you know, or like we're really, I don't know, I'm really good at a meal rota, or I'll go on a prayer rota, or but it's all short term. So I just wanted to echo that I think that's a real challenge to us.
Thank you, Hannah. Derek, is there anything you want to add in just on that kind of lived experience and or examples of where churches have struggled with this area?
Well, I think I agree with Will on my background is the Pentecostal church, and I came to faith in the early 80s in quite a strict legalistic Pentecostal church where mental health didn't exist. Everything was because you weren't trying harder or it was a demon. And so that was kind of my family background and my early experience of being in church. You know, listen to Hayley and you know, I think sometimes leaders panic when church health is mentioned, that, you know, somebody's having some problem with their mental health. We take them off everything because we don't know how to handle it because we're not experts. And most pastors feel very out of the depth. On all my theological training I did for 3 years with the Assemblies of God, we never did anything on mental health. And so it's really, we are trying to address this as church now, having done a lot of things, and even look back on my own ministry. And I think I could have dealt with that an awful lot better than I did, knowing what I now know, being equipped with what I'm now equipped with. So my passion is that we can do better. We can't undo the past, but we can certainly set things in place to help people in the future. My only kind of parting thought, or two kind of quick thoughts, is I do get concerned when I think we take mental health out of the role of discipleship. At the end of the day, the church is here to create disciples, and mental health is part of that. But we do need to keep it in the discipleship without doing the excesses that Will mentioned. And also, I think we got to be in churches that understand that it's never one size fits all. Mm-hmm. And, you know, sometimes our programs and our teaching is a one size fits all. Commitment doesn't look the same on everybody. It doesn't, because of capacity, because of seasons, because of where you're at in life. So I think we've just got to get a lot better at this, be far more equipped. But the average pastor of the average church, if there's such a person, would probably feel, from my experience, pretty out of the depth. So if a Hayley was in our church years ago, we just wonder what to do. So quick, take her off everything, because we don't know how to handle this, and we don't want to be seen as being part of something that could be a crash or something that could have, really bad implications. So let's continue the conversation. I'd love to have more conversation about the discipleship, mental health and discipleship, rather than mental health as kind of something that sits alongside another department of the church.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. And I think in some ways that's kind of, would I be right in saying that's kind of your point, Hannah, in the sense of when mental health gets separated out from everything else, that's when we run the risk of just trying to catch up with modern pop psychology rather than embedding it within how we as a church operate as a whole.
And I was thinking, yes, but also I think the privilege we have as the church is Jesus and knowing Jesus. And my concern sometimes would be that, yes, it becomes pop psychology within the church done badly, and that we almost forget that Jesus is the difference, and that we do come to God and we do offer Jesus. Now, obviously, we need to be very mindful of all the things that have been spoken about how we do that. But I sometimes worry that the opposite happens, that we're so desperate to get this right and to talk about it. We had an example recently where a very well-known person came to speak at our church, and everything he said was incredible, but I felt so sad at the end of it because Jesus wasn't mentioned once. And I was like, that's the difference for us as Christians. We do believe that, and healing doesn't always look like what we might expect. So it's not about that, but it's about walking with Jesus, isn't it? And knowing that he knows us. And so I think in that discipleship element, for me, it's almost sometimes that my experiences is people have gone too far with trying to be therapeutic and trying to use the pop psychology stuff and actually not thinking about who we are as Christians and what the Bible says as well. And so that balance is a difficult road to walk, isn't it? Sometimes, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's take that kind of question of discipleship and let's park it, because I think that would be quite a good place to kind of come to towards the end, because it looks like and sounds like understanding its role within the church and how it should be embedded within discipleship will be part of understanding how to crack the case and how to figure this one out. I want to just kind of circle back around a little bit to the themes around the issues. So as I've been listening to you guys talking, I've heard three categories of why it is still a problem within the church. So one is societal / human nature. So like when you talk about longevity versus short-term help, yes, that's a problem within the church, but it's also kind of like a societal human nature problem, is that we tend to we tend to be there for people in an initial crisis and then it drifts away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was one of my questions, is how much of this is a problem that's unique to the church versus it's a societal issue, human nature issue. So that's one thing. The other one is the theological. So Will, you touched upon some of that. And I really like how you talked about alignment with our healing and the expectation that there will be alignment. And that it feels like and sounds like that's where it stops becoming just a societal issue. And there is a unique challenge that as church we have to face, which is that there are theological things which, whether we intend to or not, kind of impact how we respond to people that have mental health. And quite often, and I just want to say this from the outset, it's often with the best of intentions at heart. None of this is ever done maliciously. We don't like people with mental health, so let's figure out how to stigmatize them. It's often really unintentional, and it's coming from this place of faith and this belief that healing can happen and that prayer is powerful. So I'd like to circle back around to that. But then the other major thing we can't ignore is ignorance, which often it feels like that is actually the root cause of the problem. It's just that we have people who are have pastoral responsibilities, but actually they just don't know. They don't know how to handle these issues. They feel overwhelmed, they feel the pressure of responsibility, and they make mistakes. I would love to know, generally, what do we think is the biggest issue within the church? Is it the fact this is just a societal thing? Is it the theological undercurrents, or is it ignorance? Which one do we think is probably the biggest issue that we need to tackle? And have I missed anything out?
Well, I think the one you've missed is a fixation with healing.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that we have a very over-realized eschatology in the charismatic evangelical church, and there's a lack of focus on the eschaton and actually what it means to live a good life and then die and enter into heaven, whereas older traditions had much more of an understanding of kind of suffering, the shortness of life, the struggle of life, and an eternal home. And this fixation with healing now, the kind of heaven now modality, is just a really unsafe place for people with mental health issues in the church to live in, because effectively it sets up this dichotomy between your faith and your lack of healing, when actually the early church was filled with people with all sorts of incurable diseases. It didn't bring into question the quality of their faith. And the scripture is very clear about the struggles of this life, and in this life we'll have trouble, and we live in tents, groaning for a heavenly home, and I have this thorn in the flesh that I've prayed for 3 times and it's not been released from. And so this fixation with healing now as if it proves the power of God.
Mm.
I think it's just quite dangerous. I believe in healing. I've seen healings. I pray for healing. But what's difficult is this framework of over-realized eschatology. And sometimes I wonder if the person praying really cares for the person who they're praying for, or that they just want to score a goal in the healing agenda. So, you know, I hear people describing and testifying around the healing that they've seen in a person as if they've won a football match, you know, and this kind of collective testimony as if I have somehow, as a prayer warrior, won a battle over someone else's life. There's a disinterest in the consequences of what's happened to that person. And that's a massive problem as far as I'm concerned. You know, if we're not praying like we're caring for people, we shouldn't be praying. You know, when we're praying for people, we need to demonstrate that we're caring for people. I mean, ultimately, prayer is a conversation with God about our heart's intent. So if we're not praying for people, demonstrating our heart's intent to God for that person, then there's something wrong with our prayer life. And Jesus wasn't, you know, he didn't hold back on criticizing people who are praying bad prayers. So I just that for me is a major issue that I've seen time and time again. And at Minor Soul, we have had countless requests from people who are asking the question, please, can you tell people to stop praying for us? As in, please stop praying for us for healing. Ask me what's going on in my life and pray for the things that matter to me. Like, I've got schizoaffective disorder. I'm on medication. I'm okay. But recently I lost my mum. No one wanted to pray for me because I was grieving. They all just wanted to cast out the demon schizoaffective disorder in my life. I mean, like, what's going on with that? So it's a massive problem. Addiction to healing, addiction to the over-realized eschatology of the now, and a lack of real love for the individual we're praying for.
Well, let's springboard off that, because I think these are all issues that are not societal, and they're not really ignorance as such. It is theological. It is kind of a misunderstanding of the things that we believe in and how we apply them. So we all believe in prayer and healing, but it's the way in which we apply that to how we outwork church life, how we outwork discipleship, how we outwork pastoral stuff. I think there is a performance element to what you've suggested, Will, that maybe is unique to this current day and age, where we feel like we're competing with not just every church in our local neighborhood, but every church in the entire world. So the goal scoring does feel like maybe that is a unique thing. To pass it on to other people, like what Will was talking about there in terms of prayer, because prayer is huge, and often so much of the mistakes unintentional mistakes that people make often happens within the arena of prayer, of either somebody asking for prayer, somebody trying to deliver prayer. So just pass it to the room. Is there anyone that would like to speak into that specifically around? I would love to hear, does that feel common, like a common experience around the obsession with healing and that full life story, and only wanting to kind of bring the perfect story to the stage rather than kind of dwell in the messiness of the middle ground? Does that feel common? Is that a common issue within church?
I think people don't write paperbacks that is, you know, for the last 25 years, I've not been healed. It's not a great seller, is it? So we tend to tell one side of the story as church. We tend to testify of what God did. And I think we've got to have an understanding of we were healed, we are being healed. Ultimate healing is in our eternal place in heaven. So I think as church leaders who are ministering to congregations of people that are so diverse and so many backgrounds and so many conditions, I don't know about you, but I constantly relying on the gift of discernment. If, you know, all the things that I need now as a leader, I need discernment. I need to know, what am I dealing with? How do I help this person? Is this something that is beyond my pay grade and I need to get specialist help, even within the context of discipleship, because I don't want to go outside of that. But it is a challenge to help people, because we, you know, Will is right. We have got people that are long-term ill and are managing it beautifully. You know, Paul had his thorn in the flesh, and, you know, God didn't take it away. And so how we manage the struggle of life is the discipleship process. And if we are fixated with wham bam, prayer line, healed, it's all done and it's done, you know, it's seeing God as a transactional thing. And God is not a transaction, he's a relationship. So I think we've got to, as local churches and as local leaders, understand that we are to care for our flock. We are to show compassion. There's no two of our flock the same. And we've got to have an incredible level of discernment of what we're dealing with. Because sometimes, you know, we are dealing with spiritual issues, and sometimes we're dealing with medical issues and neurological issues. Sometimes it's just a relational issue, because, you know, we are also in a world where, you know, not everybody, but people do play top trumps with mental health. And whenever they want to, you know, kind of opt out of the discussion, it's mental health, and that tops everything. And so it's problematic. There's no one liner of solving all this, but I think we do need to have an incredible amount of discernment as local leaders, local pastors, church leaders, so we get it right and help people.
I think as well that the humanity in general, but extending to the church, are ill-equipped or just uncomfortable with the idea of sitting with like negativity, specifically in the church, because we have hope, we have salvation, we have these things, we can exchange this for God's love and peace and freedom, and because all those things are available to us in the spiritual realm, like I don't think there's enough equipping of how to sit in the negative, because it's like we need a reason. Is it generational sin? Is it individual sin? Is it whatever? We need an answer, because otherwise it leaves you with a gap of, why is God not doing it? It must be them, or it must be God, or it must be some other like reason we can tangibly identify. And I think for me, I've seen that as a big problem, because like we've said, a lot of people, it is the long-term journey with mental health especially. And yeah, and I think the other sort of side of that I've seen come into play in kind of my upbringing of like sort of evangelical, non-denominational, charismatic like sort of churches has been, it's almost pop psychology, which we've talked about, but it's almost like pop gospel, because it's taking those bits, the nice bits that say, if you steward your finances well, God will give you more of them. If you steward your mind, body, and soul, which I'm really, really glad we talk about these days, but if you steward them, God will heal you, God will give you peace, God will do this. So there's then an assumption that if you're not experiencing those things, it's because you didn't steward them well. And I think, to go back to why I was kicked off teams, I think that was the kind of mindset that they had was, well, why are you still struggling? It must be because you're not going to God enough, or you're not praying enough, or you're not even just the spiritual things. Maybe you're not eating healthily enough. Maybe you're not going out in nature and doing things for your mind or your soul, or, you know, like all the elements that make a healthy person, relationships, community, all of that stuff. Maybe there must be one of those that you're not doing. So we've taken it away from it being as over spiritualized as maybe it would have been 20, 30, 40 years ago, and praying out a demon, but we're replacing it with this thing of like, well, it's still got to be someone's fault, because maybe it can't be God's, so it has to be yours. And I think that's also comes from that same uncomfortableness with uncertainty, or having to have an answer, when really there's a lot of things we don't know about God and life and joy and peace. So for me, that's a huge one. Yeah.
I think quite a lot of people experience, you know, in leadership, so working with leaders, the presumption very often is about rebellion. So the sort of idea of a rebellious spirit or a rebellious attitude, and this is again rebellion against an alignment to the will of God for your life. So if you establish simply that the will of God for your life is that you will live contented, peace-filled life, that your mental health will be good, effectively, if you are a child of God, then not experiencing that is in itself an act of rebellion. As Hayley's eloquently put it, that rebellion has an origin. So the origin is either that God is bad or that you are bad. Well, God can't be bad, so ultimately you must be bad. You must be living in rebellion against that particular mentality. So this is again where where, you know, simplistic theology around a conditionality, the way God is working now is X. If you don't fit within that framework, then you're Y. That's what you get where mental health is concerned. Because, you know, really, I think many well-meaning leaders are trying to defend the nature of God as good. So what we do is we come back to this idea of like, it becomes addition to the gospel. Why is God good? Well, God sent his son Jesus to die on the cross for our sins, so we might be resurrected to eternal life with him. But that's a far off story. So we want to tell ourselves much more proximal stories. And those stories are often the stories of healing, which are great stories. But the danger of using them as a measure of the goodness of God is that we all know that healing is an incomplete journey. We all still die. And therefore, what do we measure the goodness of God on? Is it the amount of years you live, or is it the peace of your mind, or is it the health of your body? What is it? And then we come back to this idea that, you know, effectively what we're doing is we're putting the character of God in the balance against the longevity and well-being of a person's life. Well, God's goodness is not measured by my ability to live well or have peaceful thoughts. You know, God's goodness is innate, but leaders are trying to prove to their congregations that God is good and that he heals today. So all that's happening is that people with mental health conditions who have entrenched problems are ending up disproving what they'd long to prove. And that is a problem. That's where this idea of rebellion comes from. That's why that stigma exists. And I think we have to have a much, much more complex, as Hayley said, and much more theologically sound understanding of the incomplete nature of healing in the New Testament. And Jesus actually says in Mark 1, when he's healed many at Simon Peter's mother's house, and the disciples have chased him up the hill, and he's basically gone AWOL to spend time with the Father in prayer. When the disciples say everyone's looking for you because basically everyone wants you to heal them, Jesus doesn't even respond. He said, let us leave this place. And they cross the Sea of Galilee. And he says, to preach the gospel, for that is why I've come. Jesus didn't come to heal people. Jesus came to preach the gospel. And any leader who says otherwise haven't done their Bible study properly. Healing in the New Testament is always a sign of the inbreaking kingdom of God. Jesus didn't say that healing was why he came. Salvation was why he came. But we want to make healing the reason that he's come, like the disciples did, and that becomes a problem. It becomes an idol in a contemporary church.
I was oh, sorry, Bryn, do you want to say something?
No, you go for it. You go for it.
I was just thinking about what you were saying, Will, about the kind of relationship between prayer and healing, because I agree with you. And this is not mental health, so I have a child with severe complex physical health needs. And I was thinking, I wonder if that's an interesting statement in our church, because she's very far from healed. There's lots of complex needs. So I wonder if that has an impact on our environment, because she's there every week and she's very obvious. But I was thinking about that relationship between prayer and healing and our expectation and what we think prayer is. And that so often it just becomes this like list of requests to God, and that isn't prayer at all. That prayer is about our communion, our communication with God and being in relationship with him. And that I wonder if that's also one of the things that happens, that we think if we're somebody says, can you pray with me? It's like, oh, right, yes, something has to be fixed. I have to ask for something to be different, rather than just bringing the reality of our lives and our situation, as you would with your person, like your friend here, before God. And one of the things we've been challenged recently about, which I think is relevant to this as a church, is around lament. And like, are we any good at lamenting? What do we think about that? When people come into our meetings, is there space to really not be okay and to lament, and to turn up on a Sunday and feel like there's room and there's space for that? And we've got a long way to go, but I think it's something we've really been challenged on as a church, around how much are we deliberately making space for that, acknowledging that God is still God in the depths of our sorrow and our despair, that he's still the God of hope when we're in despair, but he also knows what it's like to sit with us in that. And it's really important that we just bring our reality to him of like, this is how I'm feeling, and I'm fed up with this, Lord, and I need you to know, and I need to be able to speak about it, and I can stop there, and there's nothing more. I don't have to do that. And also I can just say, this is my reality, I guess, as we read lots in the Psalms, don't we? And I was just thinking about, I think we've been challenged as a church when we're thinking about this this difficulty between sometimes prayer and healing, and where we sit in our expectations of like, do we need to set some different foundations? And is learning to lament one of the ways we help the church on this journey of like, it's okay for us just to come and be real before God, and that doesn't mean anything's fixed or anything's different or anything better, but he is still unchanging. I don't know if I've explained that.
Yeah, it's such an important point, Hannah. And I've always, sort of, my view is that the health of a church can be measured on its capacity to grieve together. And having been a priest for 20 plus years, you know, you bury a lot of people and you see grief worked out locally. But the ability to grieve well together, particularly when there's been what we call premature death, so, you know, the death of a child or death of a young adult, the ability to grieve together is a sign of the health of the church and ultimately good discipleship. But what you notice about churches which haven't got that health is they can't grieve. What it has to become an enemy story. So ultimately it becomes a binary story that the devil has stolen a person from us and that this is spiritual warfare. Because to acknowledge that God's presided over this death and hasn't healed the individual doesn't fit within the theological framework of the church. So in a way, it's a more dramatic version of what we've been describing at a mental health level. But what we do know is, again, that a diverse church is a healthy church. So what you've described about your child, and in other churches where there's a strong welcome to people who have got a diverse range of needs and experiences, is that communion is formed around a real table. Always be suspicious of churches where everyone looks young, vital, healthy, and like they've got 80 years ahead of them, because guaranteed the people who are vulnerable have already left the church. And that's a massive issue. If our churches haven't got in the proverbial characters from the New Testament, you know, the man on the mat, the woman with bleeding, the Ethiopian eunuch, you know, if they're not present in our churches, there's a sign that our churches are unconsciously hostile to incomplete healing reality or some sort of discriminative model. So everyone has to look the same, talk the same, walk the same, be the same, and we're all leaning into a real kingdom model where everyone is well, healthy, and they can live for at least 80 years. And so I think that sort of, if people with mental health issues want to feel safe in church, find a church where there are a lot of people who have an incomplete experience of healing. And like you say, ask what the question is, what is the point of prayer? Conversation with God. You know, in my conversation, I'm healed many ways. Sometimes I might be healed physically, I might be healed mentally, but I'm always healed in a conversation with God. But if my healing is reduced to merely the symptoms that I'm experiencing, then I really haven't understood what prayer is about at all. And if I'm trying to measure healing as the measure of the quality of my prayer, I've really lost sight of the value of prayer, and it's just become a commoditized experience. I think it's such a helpful point to share. Thank you, Hannah.
One of the things I'm fascinated by listening to you guys all talk is there's a couple things going on, and one of the things I'd like to do, maybe we can come on to this in a minute, is to look at the anatomy of church, because the church, when we talk about church, is made up of so many different elements. You get your prayer time, you get your sermon slot, you get your welcome, you get small groups happening throughout the week. There's so many different ways in which each one of those can inadvertently contribute to the stigmatization of mental health. So worship, for example, if you're not in a great place and all the songs are really upbeat and God, you are great and I love you, and that's not how you're feeling, you can very inadvertently end up feeling stigmatized because you're not in the place that everyone around you seems to be in. So I'd like to spend a bit of time looking at the anatomy of a church and going, okay, where within the anatomy, where are some of the biggest potentials for pitfalls? Because it strikes me just listening, and when you were talking, Will, about the theology and some of the things that we communicate, it feels like sermons are one of the biggest potential pitfalls because because you have to condense down complexity into a simple narrative. It's so easy to unintentionally communicate the wrong thing, and the wrong person, or the right person coming in for a message that inadvertently ends up being about God's healing power, but they aren't feeling healed, will kind of walk away, wondering what's wrong with them. So I'd like to come on to that. I'd like to dissect that. I would also like to start to think about, within me of the church, where is the potential to have the biggest impact of removing the taboo? is it in how we preach? Is it in how we do our prayer? Is it in the types of songs we sing, and singing more lament songs? The old hymns seem to be able to do it so much better in a way than modern worship music, in terms of really creating space for that. But before we do that, I would love to just make sure we've really unpacked what the potential issues are, because so much of what we've talked about is the unintentional things that contribute towards the stigmatization. And is there anything else that we haven't mentioned in terms of the unintentional things, the examples of where people try and say the wrong thing, but it ends up doing quite a lot of damage, or people run a healing service because they want people to be healed, but that inadvertently leaves people feeling like if they're not healed, there's something wrong with them? Are there any other examples that we can think of and share where people, whether it's through the best of intentions, unintentionally say the wrong thing, or any other theologies that we preach about that there's truth in, but unintentionally leave someone in the pew feeling stigmatized for the things that they're carrying and they're journeying through? Derek, I know it's fair to put you on the spot, but is there anything that you can think of in terms of that unintentional things that Christians say out of the, sometimes the goodness of their own heart, but they just end up doing more damage than they do good?
Oh, golly, how long have you got?
5 minutes.
It's like when you've just broke up from a long-term relationship and somebody in church says, there's fishing, others fish in the sea. We get it wrong all the time, don't we? And you can't help what people in the church say to one another. The church can't police that. I think you do have to be responsible for what comes out leaders and what comes out the pulpit. I think people have got to feel seen, heard, and understood. Because, as a church leader, I plan a service. I can't say to the 500 people, can you all ring in and tell me how you're feeling on the Saturday night, and I'll gauge the service towards you. If we're going to go down that route, we're not going to build anything. So what we've got to do is create a togetherness, a family, where, yes, you can come in broken, messed up, confused, misunderstood. And you can come into church and you've had a promotion that week and the kids are behaving and everything's great. Or you can come in, there's been a bereavement, you've been made redundant, you've had a doctor's report. I think the job of the church is to pull people together. I think isolation is a killer. Isolation is, for me, isolation is the playground of the devil. He will play with your mind and play with, and particularly in a social media age where everybody's having a better time than you. Everybody's church is better than the one you go to. Everybody's pastor is cooler than yours. Everybody understands you, but the people that you're with. And so I think we need to, as churches, to work hard at creating a place where, yeah, you can come and it's okay to be a bit messy. And we'll pray with you and stand with you. But equally, don't come and insist everybody else who's not in your condition has to fit into your narrative. I think that's not community. And I think to understand, and I hope we come on to this, the power of community. The power of community is not that we agree. The power of community is that we're with people that we don't agree with. And in that tension, because mental health isn't a problem to be solved, it's a tension to be managed. And I think we've got to manage where people are at and help people. I also don't want to rob them of the opportunity that God could do something. James tells us, if there are sick and needy among you, call for the elders of the church, and the prayer offered in faith heals the sick. Now, is that a problematic text? Well, if it's abused, it's a problematic text, but it's in the Bible. And it's part of the remit of local eldership is to pray for people. And so I don't want to negate that. I think the tension of in the context of preaching is you've kind of got 10% of each, kind of the margins of people you're preaching to, who are the exception rather than the rule. And when you come together as a church on a Sunday with all ages and all backgrounds and diversities, it's very, very difficult to tidy everything up in a 20-minute or a 30-minute, or if you're a Pentecostal, a 50-minute talk that covers every base. And so I think there's got to be grace as a community. There's got to be understanding. There's got to be, there's got to be real community. And I don't just mean come on a Sunday, but, shared lives together, where people can be broken, and it's okay. And we're not here for the short term. We're here for the long term. And, it's a tension to be managed. And as a pastor, that's my everyday, that's my lived experience. I'm trying to manage this.
Thanks, Derek. I think there's loads of what you've talked about that I think will come out a lot in our discussion tomorrow, which is when we sort of really look at the challenges churches face, because you've just described a load of them just there in the terms of the practicality, catering to lots of different people, the challenges there, but also the benefit of community and bringing people together. Any other examples that are on people's mind of kind of unintentional things that people say? Other examples of aspects of church life that can just inadvertently end up doing more harm than good? Hayley, I feel like you.
Yeah, I've got one that might sound like a bit of a curveball, but I think because we've got churches filled with people that are so filled with compassion and empathy for those who are suffering, there's a real risk of like codependency. So essentially, if someone comes into your church with especially if they've got like severe mental health or like higher needs than the kind of average person in your congregation, and then you'll find that those who are in sort of pastoral roles have like the high levels of empathy, and naturally they'll either drift towards each other or be told like this person needs extra support, go to them. And while I think having that extra support is in itself a good thing, and having the right people in place to help with that, I do think there's a risk of when it goes wrong, you have a really pastoral person who actually really likes to be needed and feel useful because they're helping this person, right? But then the person who's receiving the help is not actually empowering. At a certain point, it can go wrong and become disempowering, because if they were to get better, this key support role is going to lessen because they don't need it anymore, right? But so if they're not like fully integrated into the church community and they've got support in other places, and maybe this is more unique to the church or maybe it's not, and I don't have an answer for it. And I think pastoral care is super important, by the way. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm wondering in some cases if that actually keeps people stuck, or for the congregation makes it think that those people and their issues are not something they need to go near, when actually, like in the early church, mental health, physical health, finances, they shared all of it. It was everyone's problem, and everyone made sure no one went without, and everyone was provided for. Like disability, mental health is all of it. And actually the way that maybe more modern churches set up, I think just kind of separates that a little bit. Again, I don't have the answers, but I think in some cases that can become disempowering when it's supposed to be a helpful thing. I don't know if anyone agrees with that or not, but
No, I think it's a very good point, Hayley. I mean, I think codependency is a real commonality, but I think it speaks to a bigger problem, or a slightly different problem. And that problem is the siloization of the church, which you described there. You talked about integration in the early church. There is undoubtedly this idea in many churches that you have to get healed to be useful. So if you think about a lack of, and this doesn't necessarily count physical healing in most instances, or there's some conditions where there is sort of spiritual dubiousness about it. But with mental health, there's a sense that you're in the waiting room until you're well. So you experienced it in reverse. When you were struggling, you were taken off of rotas. I've seen it the other way around. You come in struggling, and the assumption is when you're healed, then you can be useful. So the assumption is, like, I'd like to help out in the children's ministry. Do you have any mental health problems? Yes, I've got an anxiety disorder. Well, when you're better and you've overcome that, then it would be great to get you involved in the children's ministry. Well, why can't I be involved in it now? Well, you're not healed, and we can't really have people with mental health problems helping with our children's ministry. So again, we've got assumptions around mental health. Mental health is a sign of danger. You're potentially dangerous. Mental health is a question of your capacity or ability. Again, stigma associated with your ability to make good decisions. Then there's this spiritual recourse. Are you spiritually clean? Could you be unclean spiritually? We don't really want that happening, within the context of our children's ministry. So many of the Christians we work with feel that their spiritual life, their discipleship life is basically in the waiting room until they get well. The trouble is, then you've got a chronic issue. You might spend your whole life in the waiting room of church, effectively being allowed to attend only. And you know, for some of them, they feel like this is almost like a safeguarding bond. You know, they're like, haven't done anything wrong, haven't done anything bad. You know, I feel like I've been treated. I've on a lifelong contract of observation until I'm better, and I think it's just a great sadness, because the church itself, you know, Charles Spurgeon was depressed for 20 years, best preacher in this country has ever seen. Martin Luther, the founder of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, had terrible anxiety and OCD. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is not about his spiritual warfare, it's about his OCD struggles. Florence Nightingale, by bipolar disorder. Mother Teresa was chronically depressed for her whole ministry. William Cooper, who wrote the Olney Hymnal, attempted suicide in the bath and was fished out by John Newton and wrote There's a Fountain Filled with Blood. You know, these are some of the most important people in our Christian megaverse of celebrityness. You know, these are the people who founded Protestantism. I mean, the Wesley brothers, all sorts of tendrils into mental health. Like, it's just fascinating that none of these people were held back in the waiting room. They started movements. I mean, they started reformations, and yet they had quite chronic mental health problems. So something's gone wrong between the 18th century and now, that it's you know, it's not okay until you're well. And like you say, I'm not quite sure what it is.
Would it be fair to say then there has been a shift? I'm going to summarize this appallingly, and I want you to tell me whether I'm completely off with this or not. But there has been a shift, and I want to know whether it's the big picture shift or a small picture shift from feeling really content with the messy middle, feeling okay with the lack of healing, feeling okay with the unresolved, the unhealed story. Whereas at the moment, is it a modern church issue where there is an overemphasis on leading from strength, on celebrating the healed story, of making sure people that are in positions of leadership are fully healed and are fully strong and fully capable? Are we talking about generational shifts? Are we talking a theological shift? Like, what does anyone have a sense as to why we feel like there potentially is a problem where actually we just don't know how to manage complexity and manage uncertainty at the moment? Is it a current issue, or is it just this stuff's hard and it's church life is complex?
I think it's changed. So what Will just talked about, you know, massive Christian leaders in the church who were dealing with, you know, life controlling things, in a church that didn't have any paradigm for mental health. I think the dichotomy is that now we have got a paradigm for mental health, but because we're still trying to work it all out, we are putting people on the bench. So all those people weren't on the bench because nobody thought they had a problem. It would have been put down to other things, or they're just like that. And now we've got language, we've got a bit of understanding, and, you know, a bit of understanding can be very dangerous. And so, you know, I think sometimes because leaders, and, you know, and speaking as a leader, when you find out somebody is struggling with their mental health, you know, I think our job is to help them feel important, to feel part of the community, to help them function without doing something that just exasperates the issue. So if somebody is struggling with an anxiety disorder, then, you know, don't put them on the car park at the biggest event on an Easter Sunday where they'll probably not help them. So I think we've got to navigate these things on an individual basis. I don't think we can have a one size fits all policy. We've got to have discernment. We've got to have compassion. And also we've got to, you know, it's if somebody is connected into the church, we've got to be honest and open to say, this is what I can do. and this is what I can't do. The onus is not just on the church leaders, the onus is on the individuals as well to articulate. And that can only come out of a good relationship. And I think if we create great relationships within the church, people are more likely to articulate what they feel they can and can't do, what they would like to do. And they don't just feel like we've said, Hayley said, Will said, they're kind of benched forever until they're, you know, ransom, healed, restored, forgiven, because that's going to be an awful long time.
The autonomy is really powerful in this situation, just to give people a open discussion. It's not like, we've observed you, this is what we've observed, this is the kind of consequence, like you're being told off or put in a cage for as long as it goes on for. But just having that choice, like I know I said about coming off of worship teams, but there's actually been times where there's been a worship leader I've been rotated on for that Sunday. They've called me the day before and said, look, I've just been praying about the service, I've been praying about the team. When I was praying for you, I just felt like maybe a nudge to call you and see how you're doing and see how you're feeling about tomorrow. And in that case, we came to the conclusion, like, I was really struggling and it would actually be really helpful for me not to be on the team that Sunday. But the difference was, it was a two-way discussion, that I had autonomy as a human. I wasn't kind of simplified down to my issues and told, well, as a result, you've ticked this box, you now need to be off the team. Like the impact of that was so different. And like you said, I think it's definitely case by case, but having that kind of safe relationship to come as you are and be as you are, and don't have to fix it all, but like, let's decide together what this means for you and how you want to engage. I think that's so powerful.
I think that's, I mean, Derek, I'm sorry, I hope you don't mind coming back to me on this sort of in terms of the knowledge element, but I was really surprised. I've been really surprised about what level of awareness some of those greats had about their mental health. The Wesley brothers, particularly, and Susanna Wesley, Charles's wife, seemed to have quite a high level of knowledge around depression. They were trying to save people from going into institutions. Really interesting letters around their awareness of like bedlam and asylums and how damaging they would be. And they had quite a holistic view of kind of mental health care in community. The monastic system in this country effectively was the foundation of mental health care treatment, residential treatment in our society since the Middle Ages. And, you know, awareness around mental health, although the language was different, you know, talked about melancholy as the language of depression, which is really quite an ancient word. Interestingly, frankincense was a ancient treatment for depression. And so frankincense was burnt, oliberum it was called, as a way of you being released from depression. So when we think about our historic experience as church, I just wanted to point out that it's not that we just now are aware of mental health in terms of we have a contemporary clinical understanding of their origins, but we fundamentally changed the way in which we approach care. And I think, I mean, historically, I'd argue that when Freud and Jung appeared in the sort of the turn of the 20th century, they created a counter response in the Protestant church, which was that they effectively were psychoanalyzing people and psychologizing away sin. So sin wasn't an objective experience. Sin was something that was just a way in which we defined our choice of action. So they de-objectified sin and made it, if you like, a choice orientation, and that choice was linked with our socialized conditioning. The church immediately reacted, the global church, by removing things like scrupulosity, which was the term they used for false guilt. So there suddenly was one form of guilt, and that was that if you feel guilty, you are guilty. But scrupulosity in the 18th and 19th century was a real problem, as it is now. We talk about that within OCD. So there is a kind of historical reason behind the hardening of the Protestant church against mental health treatments, and that's that some of the psychological treatments appear to undo some of our core theology. And I think that there is a sort of, if you like, this historic moment at which the church became less willing to sit in the ambiguity and adopted a harder position. And the consequence of that we're still living out today. But I like to look back and sort of think, well, people were more willing to live with uncertainty in a world which was generally more uncertain. Now we're looking for more proof and rational outlooks.
That's great, Will, and totally agree with all that. We've got about 15 minutes left, and what I would love to do is to start to flip the script a little bit and think through, what does it look like to have a really mentally healthy church, a church that is intentional about mental health not being a taboo subject, and what would it look like for someone to walk in and to go, oh, I feel at home here, I feel like I can be myself here. And I would like to do that with thinking about the anatomy of a church, thinking about, you've got leadership, you've got your welcome team, you've got worship, you've got your sermons, you've got your prayer time afterwards, you've got your midweek groups. There's so many different things that make up church. And one thing that I'd be really interested to know is, thinking about the anatomy of a church, thinking about everything we've discussed around what's led us to this point, around the unintentional consequences of certain theologies, certain views. What do you think in all of that, in the anatomy of a church, is the biggest potential to shift this narrative? Where I know the answer will probably be, we need to do it everywhere. But if we were trying to focus in and kind of go, well, actually, this is the space in which we can bring back in that being prepared to live in the discomfort, where can we do that piece, that portion of creating permission to be uncertain, permission to be not okay, permission to live in the discomfort? Where does that portion sit in the anatomy of church? Either that was a really vague question, or everyone's stumped by what an amazing question that was.
Well, I'm a Pentecostal, so if there's a gap, we have to jump in because we can't cope with silence. I think a healthy church, in the context of what you said about being a healthy church emotionally, a healthy church mental health, is to know that you're not a healthy church mental health. That there's people with all different conditions of where their mental health is up to. And mental health is not a permanent condition of where you're at. Mental health can change. We've had people in our church who have been totally fine and then gone into a season of mental health problems, and the other way. So mental health changes, and there are some key points and triggers and all these things. So I think it's just being aware. We've got to upskill ourselves. I don't think every pastor has to become a psychotherapist, but we do need to have access to people who have skills beyond what you would probably get in more of a theological training, to help us and to assist us and to be part of the narrative of help, of how we offer people. I think we've got to be careful we don't put people in boxes and allow people to change. If Jesus cannot transform somebody, if we don't believe in the regenerative power of the gospel, then we're in the wrong business. We've got to believe in change. I think that the problem is when we try and organize that change and implement it on our terms with our parameters. But I think we've got to believe in transformation. We've got to believe that you can serve God and not be in a great place. You can't read the Psalms. I mean, David did all incredible things, and some Psalms you think this guy needs help, and other Psalms you think he's on top of the world, and everything in between is the plethora of human emotion. So I think there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing. I think it's. I was with some leaders in Harrogate, as you said last week, and I was saying asking the right questions is a better place to start. If you asked every pastor, do you lead a healthy church, they'd probably say yes. It's a rubbish question to ask. You've got to ask the question, are there elements to your church and ministry that could be healthier? Because that's a better question, because we can all answer that with a glorious amen. Yeah, there are areas we can be better. There are things we can do better, and an awareness starts the whole process of journeying in those areas. So I think that's where we've got to start, and keep that dialogue, keep that narrative, keep that conversation live and helpful, and not one size fits all.
Thank you, Derek. And I love that reframing question, because you can really see that in action. You change that question, and suddenly every church goes from "No, we don't have a problem" to "Yes, of course, we need to be better." So that's great. Hannah, can I pick on you? I'd love to know what your thoughts are in terms of the areas of church where that has the biggest potential to actually shift this narrative, and be better.
I was just thinking about modeling as leaders, our own vulnerabilities. And that can be a really difficult thing to do, can't it? And I don't think it's all dependent on the leadership team in any way, but I think there's something about especially if you have a church in which that's an obvious thing, that there's people up the front or those kind of things, that there's a vulnerability and an honesty there that says we're not okay all the time, and that's an okay thing. I think that's really important, and I think that can have a big impact on kind of the community around us. And I was thinking back again, I guess, to just our expectations of who walks in our doors, and are we open to kind of everybody? Does that make sense? Or do we actually have a bit of a filter on who we're expecting, and there's a reaction to that, or the kind of questions that get asked around, I don't know, where do you come from, or what do you do for a job, or rather than just how's your week been? Again, I think just reframing when we meet people for the first time, how we interact with somebody, and not being afraid of what we don't know. And I think that's really important in all of this as well, and not feeling like we have to have all the answers, because we don't. We kind of hold that theologically, but then I think sometimes we get scared as the church societally that we have to be seen in a certain way, and we have to be seen to be doing it right, and we must do this, we must get it right, and actually not being afraid of being able to say when we don't have an answer or we don't know something. I don't know if that's probably answered your question, Bryn. I mean, no,
you touched on points there. You touched on kind of the importance of welcoming, the importance of people's first interaction. Like, is it genuine care and concern, or is it not? Loads of things in there. I think the modeling one is really interesting, because from my experience, when you see where it is modeled at the front of the church, it does completely change the culture. But it still begs the question, well, how do you model it well? And what does modeling it well look like? Are we talking about the types of things we choose to preach on? Are we talking about the things that we choose to share? It can be hard. And I think one of the things that I expect to come up tomorrow is when we sort of put this question to church leaders and thinking through the challenges of a church, is that question of how do you do vulnerability well from the front of the stage, when you also want people to be confident in your leadership. You also want people to come away with good theology. You also want people to come away with a simple story they've been able to get their head around, that often in the simplification, we unintentionally communicate something that somebody could actually find difficult. It's really helpful. What about you, Hayley? Is there anything that kind of, when you look at the anatomy of church, you think, well, actually, here's a lot of untapped potential, let's just do this bit better?
Yeah, I've got a few things. I'll rattle through them for time. But the first one is just giving people space to engage however they wish. An example, I went to like a local church near me recently, and they had a healing service, or service about healing or whatever. And what I loved about it was they did a little sermon at the beginning, they had some worship, but then they had space, and you could either go up to the front or the back, speak to the actual leaders and get prayed for. You could go and light a candle. You could read, there were Bible verses you could pick up and just read through yourself. There was kind of different options. So depending on where you were at, you could still engage. So for me, I have like chronic illnesses and disability as well, and actually didn't feel in a space where I was like, I don't really want to go to these leaders that I don't know and pray for healing, because I pray for it every day and it hasn't happened. But actually, for me to be able to just sit there quietly and be allowed to do that and not feel like I have to engage the same way everyone else was, my faith was allowed to be there at whatever level it was at, and I really appreciated that. And I think also in line with that, just being less of like, we have very curated services in some churches, especially with the rise of, you know, even Christian music these days. It's so curated, like you see like the big churches doing it and everything sort of sounds the same, looks the same. It's very professional. And while I'm all for excellence and professionalism, I think within a church setting, I would love to make more space for, you know, that person at the back who has a disability. They're going to make a load of loud noise. I know I'm not talking about mental health specifically in that case, but are people allowed to be messy in that service, or are people going to roll their eyes and tut because it's not expected? You know, is it the norm? Secondly, I think I would love to see churches investing more in mental health, which might just look like talking about it for the first time, but it also might look like, you know, how we spend money on food parcels to send to a new parent. Well, why don't we see if we can use some of the money to pay for someone's therapy that they can't access because they don't have enough money and they need a specialist therapy? Not saying in every case that's the right solution, but I do think that, you know, you might pay towards someone's surgery. It's the same thing. Why are we see it as really separate, and maybe we shouldn't. And the third one is just looking at it wider. Things like vulnerability factors for mental health, things like poverty, low incomes, hunger, even education, all of that stuff that feels massive and is a conversation for another day. But actually, and I know so many churches do this, they have food banks, they work with schools, and I actually just celebrate that, because those things are helping people's mental health to not deteriorate, or in many cases it's actually solving the problem in a way that's sort of indirectly. So that's a celebration one, because I think churches are really good at seeing the need in front of them, and actually it's not as abstract as we think. It actually contributes to mental health as well. So they're my things.
Thank you. That's great. There's some really, really lovely ideas and celebrations in there. Will, is there anything you'd like to share? Because I know this is sort of your bread and butter, is helping churches figure this out and figuring out how to do this well. Is there anything that kind of comes to the top of your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just need to be really hopeful. I mean, God's doing something really exciting in our churches, especially at the moment. We're seeing amazing things happen in terms of how many young people are coming to church, just, you know, really across the country, excitement around the baptisms. Easter was amazing. I mean, churches are incredible because God is incredible. And I think we just got to stay really hopeful and not become sort of pessimistic about our experience of mental health. Like, things have got better and they can keep on getting better. In my world is, you know, in a sense, you know, I've been working kind of grassroots for a long time. I think I've realized that unless leaders' own mentalities change, churches don't tend to change. You know, I think leaders set the course, and I know so many leaders out there who are struggling with their mental health, but they're too stigmatized. They feel too responsible to get the help that they need. And I think what I'm really passionate about is saying, you know, we need people to be working at all levels of access in the church, but I'm really passionate about helping leaders with their mental health. What I've noticed is when you help a leader with their mental health, they become vulnerable. As Hannah said, they start modeling what it looks like to live in this tension. You know, I think that's the whole, you know, we're called to share a compassion that we ourselves have received. And I think there's something very special about receiving compassion about your mental health that you then want to share with others. And in my mind, those leaders who are leading the best, if you like, examples of mental health friendly churches are those leaders who've experienced mental health struggles themselves. And they might be completely restored, but they have a level of empathy that's just not available to other people. I mean, there's something very specific about mental health struggle, particularly in leadership, where, you know, there's a real softness, a real empathy, a real understanding, a real sense of complexity. And I think, you know, obviously we don't want every leader to have a mental health problem so we can then get them healed so they can then lead a great church. But what we do want to do is, with the groundswell of leaders who are struggling, say, actually, how can we help them? And once we've helped them, how can we help them to change the church that they're part of? So that's a really, really big one for me. And I'd encourage anyone listening, you know, don't just become a negative weather vane on the culture of your church. You know, like, Jesus is not calling us to live in the seat of mockers, or, you know, those who are like, you know, bringing judgment, but those who are bringing hope and love. And I think many people who stigmatize people with mental health problems have mental health problems themselves and haven't yet acknowledged it yet. So they're trying to push away the enemy within. You know, if someone treats you harshly, as Jesus says, you know, let's treat them kindly. And empathy goes two ways. We have to have empathy on the people who stigmatized us and criticized us and maybe sidelined us. So we can break the loop of hostility. I think that's really, really important. And I just encourage everyone to pray, to pray around the issue, pray for your church, pray for your leaders, pray for the culture, pray for yourself that you can be a witness. And if we all pray, for the sake of mental well-being in our churches, I think something powerful will happen, as it always does whenever we talk to God about the things that are on our hearts. So that would be my final encouragement, really. Let's pray about the matter in a big way.
Thank you, Will. And I think all of those points lead us really nicely into tomorrow's lunchtime conversation. So we're going to be really kind of delving deep into what the challenges are for churches when they try and remove the taboo. And one of the things that came up when we did some initial research and polled our church leaders, one of the questions that came up is, well, who's pastoring the pastors? Because as leaders, we feel a huge amount of responsibility for how we navigate this within our church, because it's complicated. It's really complicated. And as you said, healthy leaders tend to lead healthy churches. And so actually taking the time to really invest in leadership and helping people to navigate their own stuff is absolutely crucial. So tomorrow we've got Ellie Gage, from the CEO of Kintsugi Hope, will be joining us. We've got Joe Hargreaves, who's a therapist, pastor, and influencer. We've got Fiona Taylor, who's a church leader, and we've got David B. Morgan, who's a reverend and an author, and has spoken quite a lot about his personal lived experience after suffering a breakdown. So I just wondered, in the last few minutes, is there any question that you would particularly like to put to that panel? Is there anything that you would really like to see discussed tomorrow that maybe we haven't had a chance to discuss today, that is actually pretty crucial to this issue, that would need, you really hope will be spoken about?
Wow.
Hayley, I think, did you have any questions for the panel tomorrow? Any thoughts around what you would like to see them talk about?
Not specifically. I think what I lack as not being a church leader in this conversation is the how. And I think, again, nobody has all the answers, but I think it would be interesting to dig deeper into the how. We've talked about what aspects could be improved, but yeah, in my brain, I am not a leader, and I, pray for these people and bless them. But yeah, I would love to dig into that. Maybe not really a question, but I'm sure it will be going that way.
No, I think that the how is the massive question. It is the big question in all of this, which is, how do churches do it, and how do they overcome the practicalities of engaging with this stuff? I mean, even the things we were talking about in terms of serving on teams, like how do you create a team and an environment? Because I know that when we're talking about that stuff, I can imagine there's loads of church leaders listening going, I love this in theory, but I've got all these questions that are immediately popping up. What about safeguarding? What about this? What about that? So actually digging deep into the how is actually pretty crucial to giving churches the confidence that they can make some of these changes. So that's great. Hannah or Will, any kind of parting words or questions?
Yeah, no, I think I'd like them to explore the systems that they have in place already. I think every church has an unspoken, maybe an unwritten system for how it operates in ministry. And, people with mental health issues and physical disabilities are often experiencing that system in practice, but it's often ill-defined. And I think just to kind of explore really what system are leaders using to discern leadership opportunities, ministry expectations, prayer expectations, and then how would they amend or augment the system if they had the chance to start from scratch. I think that's a really helpful way of working. I mean, I think parting shot would just be to encourage, to say, look, the fact that we care, I know Mercy care, the great guys at Kintsugi and Sanctuary, and all these great organizations, they care. They represent thousands of Christians who care in the UK. And I think if you ask most people, do you care about mental health? Most Christians would say, yeah, I really care about mental health. We're here because we care. We can care better. But isn't it great to know you're amongst a great cloud of witnesses who all care for the same thing? We care for people. Jesus cares for us. And, loving the lost, the last, and the least, loving those who are struggling in different elements of their life, serving them and giving glory to God whilst we do it. I mean, it's our privilege to be in an organization where we can have a podcast well, we talk about how much we care about something that other people maybe don't care so much about. So praise God for all of you and all of the people you represent too, and just grateful that we can get in the room together and have a great conversation.
Thank you, Will. Appreciate that. Derek, Hannah, any kind of parting thoughts, questions? No.
I think you know, as a church leader who is constantly thinking about the people that I lead and the systems that we manage, and really looking at the culture of the church, because you know, the culture of the church is incredibly important, and allowing that to be defined by vision and biblical standards, not by just what the church down the road's doing or what the church in America is doing or whatever. And I think also, you know, how do we build resilience into the church community? Well, you know, there are times we need to say things to people that, you know, that they don't want to hear. It's called truth. And we've got to do it right, and we've got to do it kindly. But, you know, we are here to care for people. We're also here to declare the truth. And that can be quite challenging in a world where we're trying to also help people be mindful of their experiences and bring them on a journey. So it's a big gig being a church leader at this time, trying to manage community of people, but it's an incredible privilege, and I don't think we should shy away from it. I think we should rejoice in it. God is doing something around our country. You know, for the first time, it feels like there's a bit of a movement forward that's, you know, that's documented and in the, you know, media that we've all read recently. So I'm hopeful. We need to do better. We need to keep talking about the right things. We need to have forums like this. We need to be able to disagree and not necessarily fall out. And we need to build a caring, resilient culture and community that can really win their world for Jesus.
Amen. Well, thank you, Derek. That's a great place to end, and I think it's going to lead us pretty well into tomorrow's lunchtime conversation. So please join us if you can. 12 o'clock to 1:30. We'll be tackling the question of removing the taboo. What are the challenges that churches are facing? So hopefully we'll see you then. Hayley, Derek, Hannah, and Will, thank you so much for your time today and your insights and your thoughts. Really appreciate it. Right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We will catch you tomorrow, hopefully. Take care.
Thanks everybody. Thank you for your comments.